Monsignor Sanchez, Margaret.
Congratulations for this very interesting point. I want to ask, what is in this vision, what is the meaning of the tax haven? Because all the money go to the tax haven, no? I think that we need to put clearly if this have some function, social or not, because this is my question.
Yeah, this is a question. I each year receive a group of students that are following a class on tax evasion. It's a professor of communication that teaches this class, and she always sends a group of students to me. And I always tell them that indeed, I mean, we economists think about this a little differently than legal scholars and maybe also than philosophers. What economists are interested in is not whether this is a good or bad practice from a moral point of view, but what are the global ramifications of tax havens. Now, tax havens might be despicable from a moral point of view and so on because they escape community and so on, but one very widespread error as far as tax havens are concerned is to think that somehow it's like Scrooge McDuck, right? So that the people are moving their money there and it just sits there and is not of any value. Now, first of all, of course, there's no cash being sent over to the Caribbeans or so, but it's property in the US, in Europe, that is being held in those islands. That is, so the crucial point is that the capital that is owned by the companies sitting in the Cayman Islands and so on is actually deployed in Western Europe and is deployed in the US. So what this means is that this capital provides for employment and provides for revenues earned by various people in the Western Hemisphere, but it cuts down the revenue of the government. So it boils down really to this. Right? So it's not a loss on a global point of view. It's a moral and it's a political problem, but it is not necessarily an economic problem. And so tax havens do not deprive the populations of the available savings. Rather, you could make the opposite case that probably if they were taxed, a greater number of those capitals would not be available for productive investment. But that's, of course, according to the law, right? That's how it should be, right?
Margaret Archer.
Thank you. I'm sure there is no need to emphasize that you know la division du travail just as well as the rest of us do. But the interesting point of that key work of Émile Durkheim was his insistence upon the need for supplementary conditions in order for the participation to be fulfilled. In particular, this chapter that students don't like reading, but it's very profitable for them to read, the last chapter on the pathologies of the division of labor, where he stresses 2 points that I'd like to ask you about. One is the dependence for a cooperative, integrated society upon certain relationships between the work groups, which you did mention. Durkheim, I think, stresses them much more when he talks about the existence of one occupational association within each enterprise, going from the top chief executive down to the lowliest cleaner, as a way of bringing home, this is judgmental on his part, the advantages that all receive from participating in the same enterprise. The second thing he stresses is the need for enterprises which depend upon private profit being integrated with other social institutions. Hence, his 3 other books on the need to have one education, one common education that all people within La République shared in common. sitting side by side on the same school benches, as he put it at one point. And then we get to the really revolutionary, if you like, Durkheim. He's not just the worried man of the Third Republic. He is also the rather daring thinker who suggested that if this was not to deteriorate into another form of hierarchy over a very short time, what was needed was the abolition of inherited wealth. Otherwise, it was unjustified because there would be no level playing field, and so on and so forth. So, when you talk about the advantages of the sharing economy, I don't see any points at which these ones that Durkheim recognized in the late 19th century being addressed, because things like Uber are not part of a sharing economy, they're part of a turf warfare. And very interestingly, and then I will stop talking, one of the forms of that warfare is between official, what we call in London, black cabs, which in many parts of Europe have been become the occupational preserve of certain ethnic groups. And this is rather valuable in places like Bradford, whereas Uber is just blatantly cost-cutting, non-integrating, and if it went on in a completely unregulated fashion, would lead to stronger and stronger hierarchical divisions amongst that particular occupational category, taxi drivers. Sorry to have been so long about that.
These were many points. So I fully agree with your take on Airbnb and Uber. So I think that there's merit in Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction, right? So of course you need to allow for technological progress and so on. So it's not because this might upset an industry that we should condemn it from the outset. But in any case, the self-praise, the self-presentation that we find in these companies, Airbnb and Uber and so on, that they present themselves as great community creators and so on, whereas in fact it's a major overhaul of an entire industry that threatens to indeed, as you say, create greater hierarchies, greater concentration than anything else that we have ever witnessed before, is swept under the carpet. Yeah, so I fully agree with this. But most practitioners on this, what they see this as well, right? As far as the division of labor is concerned, well, I think Durkheim was very much concerned with a moral problem that he saw, that if you let the free market operate unhampered, it would entail hierarchies, inequalities, and so on. And of course, the free market is not an institution that would create ever greater, it allows for great inequalities. I do not agree with Durkheim's assessment that there is a tendency for ever increasing inequalities. I do not think this is correct. And inequalities in wealth, to some extent, are actually a cause of the division of labor, right? People cooperate because they are different. If everybody was perfectly equal, there would be no opportunity for exchange. So people exchange and they cooperate because they have something different to bring to the table than other people. And I also disagree with this view on, as I've presented in the paper, right? I very strongly disagree with this view on the merits of inherited wealth. I think it's actually a very beneficial institution in a market economy. Of course, it tends to get perverted in a situation like ours, in which we have financialization, in which owning property is a huge advantage because you have collateral that allows you to multiply any initial advantage that you have, plus you have the central bank that stabilizes the economy, that is socializes part of the risks that you face by leveraging, which is completely unjust, of course, and exacerbates inequalities. So I see this rather. So, right, for me, the point is, inherited wealth per se is a good thing, right? But it can become perverted in the current situation. That's how I see it.
Me? Thank you. Thank you, Guido. Two quick question. Social market economy, as we know, it is an offspring of ordoliberalismus, which was developed in the interwar period, and then after the war, a little modified. My question is, do you believe that the thesis according to which social market economy presupposes a national economy? The very moment that we move towards a global economy, it cannot work by definition. And that is the reason why it is not working. Not because the principles are, but because you presupposes a national state which can impose the order and in a globalized economy. Second question, sharing economy. Perhaps you have shortened your presentation, but it seems to me that your interpretation of the sharing economy is different from the share economy of which Martin Weizmann wrote in 1982. Share economy is different from sharing economy, etc. So what is, do you agree on the fact that the sharing economy is economy on demand? And so it affects only the consumption side, not the production side. In the sharing, on the other hand, the share economy of which Martin Weizmann was talking had to do, first of all, with the production side. And in other words, with the moment when the wealth or income has been generated. Thank you.
Stefano, I cannot answer your question because this is the first time I hear about Martin Weizmann's book. In fact, I have become interested in the literature on the sharing economy only last year when I've been asked to give this presentation. So it was for me the opportunity to start reading on this. But I will read Martin Weizmann's book with great interest. Thanks for the hint.
Thank you, Mr. Hülsmann, for your presentation. I'm not an economist, and I leave to much more competent persons in the room an analysis of your economical statements. But I have a certain knowledge in ethics. And what did a little bit surprise me in your presentation is the implicit ethics of your reflection. For example, in one of your answers, you said about the tax havens that as an economist, you look at the consequences of certain behavior, which is completely fine. I have nothing against the transformation of economics in a purely descriptive science, which happened ultimately together with a long transformation of the value-free social sciences in the late 19th century, in the 20th century, when fundamentally the question of the formation of prices replaced the old question of value. That's fine. You can say, I simply look at consequences, but you don't do that. You give us also options for economic policies. And of course, your options for economic policies are based on values, which I do not consider as compatible with my own values, of which I think that I have perhaps a not bad justification with regard to their consistency, etc. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. Ultimately, your starting point was a classical starting point, namely that it is paternalistic to help person because it presupposes that there are objective goods. Now, of course, you can have this opinion. I remember we had a discussion several years ago here at the Academy when we discussed the American and the European system, and I mentioned as an advantage of the European system, of the German system particularly, the higher life expectancy of Germans, and I mentioned that the lack of universal health insurance in the United States, according to certain calculations, meant that 30,000 to 40,000 people die every year early. And I remember your answer. You said, well, we have to accept that. It's their decision not to buy an insurance. And here my position is, first of all, they may not have a choice to buy an insurance because they have pre-existing conditions they cannot buy in. But even if they decide to buy the money, to spend their money in alcohol or drugs instead of buying an insurance, I think it's a wrong decision. And I think it is I'm not ashamed to say, I'm as paternalistic as to say, the state has a right to say to a person, you must buy in the insurance because you have a duty to extend your life and to insure yourself against silly risks, even if this means that you have to cut down on your alcohol consumption or whatever. But this is a presupposition that you have, and it's a libertarian presupposition, which ultimately assumes there are no objective goods, but I have one value in my ethical argumentations, namely the liberty of decision. And a liberty of decision that must not limit, of course, the liberty of other people. Therefore, redistribution mechanisms are only acceptable if they are Pareto optimum, if they contribute to achieving a Pareto optimum. I mean, usually libertarian economists accept that we should avoid non-Pareto optimal situations. But this doesn't mean that this is the only morally relevant criterion. The question with inheritance is very similar. There are, based on the traditional idea of justice, that what you earn somehow should be deserved, strong arguments against inheritance. And you're right, by the way, and a lot of your analysis I found convincing, particularly when you follow Schumpeter, whom I regard as one of the greatest economists of all times. There may be some advantages to that, but my argument would then be that we enter a difficult problem of compensating and offsetting the advantages of certain forms of inheritance against the inherent injustice of inheritance. And the inherent injustice has to do with the fact that you get something which you have not acquired through your own work, through your own achievement. It's like a windfall profit. And the idea of the market economy means that if people have more money, they must have deserved it more. Deserved, of course, because they have created products that satisfy reasonable needs of other people. And I found you quite very convincing in your criticism of, for example, the enormous brain drain that occurs to not the real economy, but the financial economy. This is absolutely excellent what you did. And here you show that you are not a completely libertarian thinker, because you say, okay, even if people like to do it, the question is very simple. Can you try to render explicit all the implicit ethical principles that guide the statements that are behind your proposition of economic policies? Because there are values, otherwise economists are not allowed to make proposals. They only say these are the causes and these are the effects, and you have then to decide based on your sets of values which combination of policies is most conducive to the values that you support. Thank you.
Yeah, well, so now it's really difficult for me to answer this. I mean, this is a very big discussion. Of course, I agree that there are always ethical values at the beginning of any presuppositions, any scientific analysis and discussion and so on, most notably the commitment to truth, right?
It cannot be only that.
Excuse me?
It cannot be only that.
I do not say, but I mean, you've certainly given more thought to these things than this. I did not quite recognize myself in your presentation. My first impression is that you have a very vivid fantasy, so I did not see this at all, or maybe you see something more deeper than I saw, but I could not agree on your statement that I had some commitment. I mean, as an economist, I try really to see all the causal connections. This is what I'm mainly interested in. And then if you are in a discussion, of course, I mean, values might shine through because you have to select, right? You talk about certain mechanisms, you don't talk about others, right? But this is a question of the limitation of time, right? So then personal values come into play, yes. But it's not in the sense that I want to orient any discussion. I'm ready to discuss any consideration about causal sequences, okay? Now, but there was one other thing that you raised, but there was so many considerations. Justice of inheritance, yes. You know, I thought that the basic moral case for inheritance does not come from the person who inherits, but from the person who bequeaths. Right? He has worked all his life, or she has worked all his life. Now this money or this property is hers. Why should she not have the right to give it? And then you come and say, oh, this is unjust because this other person did not do anything, did not, do the shoe shine for you or mow your garden, or I don't know what, so that he might have merited this. You see, this is the point. I think there is a good moral case to be made for inheritance.
Thank you. I couldn't understand, because perhaps my limitations, but perhaps for other reasons, what is really a participatory society defined from the economic point of view? I didn't understand the concept really. It looks like an ideal type in the meaning of Max Weber, no? But you then compare with a critic vision market economy and shared economy with a participatory society, but also with other models, the welfare state, etc., etc. It would be helpful, at least to me, if you can say which historical realities were more close to the ideal type of the participatory society. Because you criticize all of them, but in order to understand the real meaning of participatory society, it would be helpful to have some empirical reference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I must say, as I said in my introductory statements, I was late with the paper. I had these difficulties coming up with a coherent analysis of these questions, and this related to the basic problem of defining the economics of participation, right? So I did not take any time to think through this question, which historical situation might have come closer to this. I'm pretty certain that all economies in the 20th century are rather removed from it, or have been removing from it. Maybe the US society at some point but I would not. In the US, you always had very strong monetary interventionism early on, right from the beginning of the 18th century and so on. So a clear case, maybe something like France, 18th century. I would know. I would have to really give more thought to this, right? Especially, I think permissive interventions are most harmful for the emergence of participation, right? But we always had them, right? We always had them. Now, there might have been some situation, some countries where you had them a little less than elsewhere, but I really would need to give more thought to this.
S'il vous plaît, nous avons encore 3 questions qui doivent être courtes et 3 réponses qui doivent être courtes. Donc d'abord Lubomir.
Well, I appreciate very well first part of your presentation. You are very strong in description and critical analysis. Nevertheless, both parts end in negative issues. Because so I am unable to find the positive thinking, positive issues from these critics. What personal belief do you have in economics? Implicitly, it seems to me that you incline perhaps to libertinism. That's true?
The whole idea of this, thank you very much for the presentation and the clarification of concepts, which is very important. Now, the idea behind the theme you have been treating was which economic model would be closer to the principles of the social doctrine of the Church, and which steps could be undertaken to come to a more participatory society, understood as a society which excludes nobody economically, which gives a chance for everybody to have a share in work, and so on. Okay. Then you analyzed the soziale Marktwirtschaft very clearly, and also the sharing economy model. And in each case, nothing is perfect. Each case has shortcomings. And this is why the interest of the whole reflection is precisely to find out what could we positively suggest as economists and lawyers and so on to improve the state of affairs and to come to a closer communion within the humankind, more share in everything, precisely, not only economics, but economics is the basis. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think I mean, you will always have repressive interventions as long as you have your governance. It's enshrined in the very nature of governments, right? But I think we have big problems today. Not only today. I mean, they've built up throughout the 19th century. As far as this, what I should call the welfare state for bankers is concerned, right? I mean, this has really gained an enormous life of its own. It's completely uncontrolled. It's almost as uncontrolled as the CIA, maybe more, right? I mean, this is really shocking. And I think here the church could play a huge role in encouraging all people of goodwill to think about, because I mean, as an economist, you specialize in understanding the mechanisms. You're not a specialist in coming up with the best solutions. I mean, that's also what I always tell my students. I'm just the professor, right? Of course, I have my little idea of what could be done and so on, but I'm not more of an expert there than others who might come with fresh ideas, right? So we need to think very hard about what can be done in order to come back to some natural way of organizing a monetary system, taking this enormous power out of which really perverts all elements, not only of the monetary and the financial system, but of the rest of the economy, of politics, civil society. Everything is undermined, perverted through this influence. So I think this is very, very important. This would be my number one topic, right? The objective cannot be to create some sort of perfection on earth, a paradise or something like this, but this is a major thing, and you need a lot of courage. You need a lot of courage, and need also think hard about how you can help, because if you have a transition like this invariably creates a huge crisis. So you need to think very hard about how you can help the persons who cannot help themselves in such a situation. And there too, I think the church can play a huge role, especially in a context in which governments have spent all their money on silly things like military spending and other things, and have no more money available for those who need it most. Thank you.
Well, I thank you very much. I found it a very brilliant paper, and it was a very interesting discussion. Only, I wonder, and I have a question, two questions. The minor one is an historical question and regards the soziale Marktwirtschaft. We all know the great importance of the School of Fribourg, but what about Christian social doctrine? The works of Father Gundelach, the Katholische Sozialwissenschaftliche Zentralstelle, have had a tremendous impact on the further developments of the soziale Marktwirtschaft. It is not just the beginning. There is a development, and in this development, I think there is a kind of intermingling of Christian. Second question, what is the epistemological level of your consideration? I find them very good at the level of economics, but that's different from political economy. And I see that the role of politics is not at all considered. I give you one example. According to economics, Adenauer should not have accepted the agricultural policies of Germany in the 50s and Europe in the 60s and later on. And a friend of mine, Alphonse Horten, went to him and told him, you can't do that. That's against the pure theory. And he told him, if I don't do that, I will lose the elections. And if I lose the elections, you will have no free market economy. So you better accept my way. You must consider also the points of view of those who in the short term are damaged from more liberal policies, and you must try to find a compromise with them. Otherwise, it will not work.
Well, I mean, on the last question first, I certainly have great comprehension for the imperfections of other people because I'm very imperfect myself, right? So I really have nothing to say. I perfectly understand that as a political leader, you need to take into consideration a lot of factors, not only pure economic theory and so on, so a lot of other things that come into play. I'm not convinced that it is always a pertinent argument. I mean, I immediately think of St. Paul. If I hear this argument, then I don't get elected. So should we do bad things so that good may come out of this? I'm a little, I'm more St. Paul, more Jewish in that respect. And the other question, the role of Christian social doctrine. Actually, Christian social doctrine in Germany underwent a significant change since between the mid-19th century and the middle of the 20th century. So my good friend Martin Ronheimer, he has written a few very good pieces recently. I hope he will turn them into a book in which he retraces these transformations. And what he points out in particular is the adamant opposition of Kettler, who is always presented as a left-wing Catholic and so on, social Catholic and so on, whatever this might mean, but adamant opposition to the welfare state. So he clearly saw the deeply corrupting influence that this might have, and there's a complete turnaround in that respect between Kettler in the 1850s and then the new Germans in the 1930s, 1940s, and so on.
Thank you very much.